The morning air in the valley usually smelled of damp earth and the heavy sweetness of dew clinging to the lavender. But today was different, because today I was stepping back into the factory for the first time since the funeral. My name is Isadora Finch, and for 40 years I have been the nose of Maison Finch, which means I do not just smell things, I understand them. I understand the molecular architecture of a rose, and I know exactly when a batch of jasmine was harvested just by the faint indole note at the bottom of a breath. My husband Arthur used to say that I could smell a storm coming 3 days before the clouds appeared, and he was right. But as I walked toward the heavy steel doors of our production facility, I did not smell a storm, I smelled something far worse. I swiped my keycard, and the heavy click of the lock sounded like a judge's gavel. The main floor was quiet because it was only 6 in the morning, and the workers had not yet arrived for the early shift. The machinery stood silent and gleaming under the security lights like sleeping giants of stainless steel. This place was my cathedral. It was where Arthur and I had taken a small family business and turned it into a global empire built on one simple promise, which was absolute purity. Our flagship perfume, called Cœur Pur, was the gold standard, and women all over the world wore it because it made them feel elegant and timeless. It was a complex symphony of grass jasmine and tuberose, and a secret base of ambergris that Arthur and I had perfected on our honeymoon in Corsica. I walked down the central aisle, and usually this space would smell like a garden in full bloom, trapped in copper and glass. But today, there was a sharp metallic tang in the air that made the back of my throat itch. I stopped walking and closed my eyes to focus, because vision is a distraction when you are trying to listen to the air. I breathed in slowly through my nose and dissected the aroma. There was the lingering scent of industrial cleaner and the oil from the conveyor belts. But underneath that was something discordant. It was a high-pitched chemical screech that tried to mimic a flower, but failed. My heart began to beat faster in my chest as I walked toward vat number 4, which was currently holding the aging batch of Cœur Pur, meant for the holiday season distribution. This vat held $3 million worth of product, and it was the lifeblood of our company for the next quarter. I climbed the metal stairs to the catwalk, and the metallic smell grew stronger and more aggressive. It smelled like burning plastic and cheap sugar and a lie. I reached the top of the platform and opened the inspection hatch. The aroma that wafted up hit me like a physical slap to the face. I gripped the railing to steady myself because the room seemed to spin. This was not Cœur Pur. This was an abomination. The intricate dance of natural essences was gone, and in its place was a flat and lifeless chemical soup. I dipped a testing strip into the liquid and brought it to my nose just to be absolutely certain. The top note was sharp and aggressive, and it vanished instantly, leaving behind a cloying sweetness that coated the tongue. It was Gideon, but it was the cheap industrial grade used in laundry detergents and floor cleaners. The jasmine was synthetic. The tuberose was a lab creation. I felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness, but from a pure and white-hot fury. Arthur was barely cold in his grave, and someone had already begun to dismantle the very soul of his legacy. I knew every invoice and every shipment, and I knew we had paid for the highest grade absolute from the fields in Grasse, so where was it? I climbed down the stairs with a speed that defied my 68 years because anger is a powerful fuel. I needed to see the production logs, and I needed to see who had signed off on this batch. I marched toward the glass-walled office that overlooked the factory floor, and that was when I saw him. Gideon was standing there with his back to me, and he was on the phone. My stepson was a tall man who had inherited his father's broad shoulders, but none of his father's warmth. Gideon saw the world as a spreadsheet where red ink was failure and black ink was success, and he had never understood that perfume is an art form that cannot be rushed. or cheapened. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my first car, and he was gesturing at the air with an arrogance that made my stomach turn. I pushed open the door to the office, and Gideon spun around, and he looked surprised to see me. But he quickly masked it with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He ended his call and slipped the phone into his pocket and asked me what I was doing here so early. He used that tone of voice that people use for children or the very old. It was a soft and patronizing tone that was meant to imply that I was lost or confused. I held up the testing strip, and I told him that I knew what he had done. I told him that Vought number 4 was filled with synthetic sludge, and that it was an insult to the name on the building. I watched his face closely because I wanted to see the guilt, but Gideon was a master of the boardroom mask. He sighed and walked over to the coffee machine and poured himself a cup with agonizing slowness. He told me that I was overwrought and that grief did strange things to the senses. He said that the batch in Vought number 4 was exactly the same formula we had always used, and that perhaps my nose was not what it used to be. I felt the blood rush to my face. To insult my nose was to insult my very existence. I told him that I could smell the difference between a rose grown in clay soil and a rose grown in sandy soil, and that I certainly knew the difference between real jasmine and a chemical compound made in a factory in New Jersey. I slammed the testing strip down on his desk, and I demanded to see the supply logs. I told him I wanted to see the invoices for the raw materials because I knew he had swapped them out. Gideon took a sip of his coffee and looked at me with a pity that chilled me to the bone. He told me that there was no swap and that he had personally overseen the production. He said that he was worried about me because I had been acting erratic since the funeral. He said that the stress was obviously too much for me and that maybe I should take a step back and rest at the country house. He was gaslighting me. He was standing there in his father's office and looking me in the eye and telling me that the sky was green when I knew for a fact it was blue. I walked around the desk and reached for the file cabinet where we kept the physical copies of the intake forms. But Gideon moved faster than I expected. He stepped between me and the cabinet, and he put a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, and it felt like a warning. He told me that I needed to go home and rest. He said that he didn't want the staff to see me like this. He made it sound like I was having a breakdown, when in reality, I was the only person in the room seeing things clearly. I looked at his hand on my shoulder, and I smelled his cologne. It was a custom blend I had made for him years ago for his 30th birthday, but underneath the sandalwood and cedar, I smelled something else. I smelled adrenaline. It is a sharp and metallic scent that leaks out of the pores when a human being is in a state of fight or flight. He was afraid. He was afraid because I had caught him, and now he was trying to push me out before I could find the proof. I stepped back and shook his hand off my shoulder. I told him that this was my company just as much as it was his, and that I was the majority shareholder until the will was fully probated. I told him that I would not let him sell this swill in our bottles. Gideon laughed then, and it was a dry and humorless sound. He told me that times were changing, and that the market did not care about the difference between a petal and a molecule. He said that our competitors were cutting costs, and that if we wanted to survive, we had to adapt. He admitted it without admitting it. He justified the betrayal as a business strategy. I looked at him, and I saw a stranger. I had known this boy since he was 10 years old. I had bandaged his knees, and I had sat in the front row at his graduation. And I had tried so hard to be the mother he had lost. But somewhere along the way, he had become hollow. He was beautiful on the outside, but inside, he was just like the fake perfume in the vat. He was synthetic. I told him that I was going to call the board of directors and demand an independent audit of the production line. I told him that I would not let him destroy 50 years of reputation for a quarterly bonus. Gideon's face hardened, and the mask slipped for just a second. His eyes went cold and flat. He told me that the board was already concerned about my capacity to lead. He said that if I made a scene, I would only prove their point that I was becoming senile. He leaned in close, and his voice dropped to a whisper. He told me that for my own dignity, I should just go home and garden and let the men handle the business. The rage that filled me then was so pure that it almost made me dizzy. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to throw the testing strip in his face. But I knew that he was right about one thing, which was that if I lost my temper, he would use it against me. He was baiting me. He wanted me to be the hysterical old woman so he could be the calm and rational son. I took a deep breath, and I forced my heartbeat to slow down. I smoothed the front of my jacket, and I looked him in the eye. I told him that I was going home, but that this conversation was not over. I turned and walked out of the office, and I felt his eyes on my back. I walked down the metal stairs and past the vat of ruined perfume. The smell was nausea-inducing now. It smelled like greed. It smelled like the end of everything I held dear. I walked out of the heavy steel doors and into the morning light, but the fresh air did not make me feel better. As I walked to my car, I realized that my hands were shaking. Gideon was not just cutting costs. He was making a power play. He had a plan, and I was the only obstacle in his way. I got into my car and looked back at the factory. It looked the same as it always had, with its ivy-covered walls and the tall chimney, but inside, it was rotting. I started the engine and drove away, but the smell followed me. It was stuck in my nose and on my clothes. It was the scent of betrayal, and once you smell it, you can never unsmell it. I knew then that I was in a war. Gideon thought I was old and fragile, and that I would just fade away into the background. But he had forgotten one thing. I was a Finch by marriage, but I was a survivor by nature. I drove down the winding road toward the estate, and my mind was racing. I needed to see the will. I needed to see exactly what legal leverage I had, because Gideon was acting with a confidence that suggested he held all the cards. I did not know then that he had already made his move. I did not know that the locks were being changed and the accounts were being frozen. I only knew that the son I had raised had turned into a wolf, and I was the sheep he intended to slaughter. But sheep have a way of surviving when they stick together, and I was not ready to be dinner just yet. The library of the Finch estate was a room that usually brought me peace because it smelled of tobacco leaf and old leather and the vanilla scent of decaying paper. It was Arthur's sanctuary, and for the 40 years of our marriage, it had been the place where we made our most important decisions. But as I sat in the high-backed velvet wing chair that afternoon, the room felt less like a sanctuary and more like a courtroom. The heavy velvet drapes were drawn against the afternoon sun, and the air was thick with the tension of waiting. Mr. Pendergast sat behind Arthur's massive mahogany desk, and he looked small in the space that my husband had filled so effortlessly. Mr. Pendergast had been the family attorney for 3 decades, and he smelled of peppermint candies and stale pipe smoke. He was a good man, but he was a man of rules and paper, and he did not have the imagination for treachery. Gideon sat on the leather sofa to my right, and he was the picture of grieving piety. He was wearing a black suit and holding a glass of scotch that he had not sipped. He was performing the role of the dutiful son for an audience of one. Mr. Pendergast cleared his throat and the sound was dry like rustling leaves. He adjusted his spectacles and opened the thick leather folder in front of him. He began to read the last will and testament of Arthur Finch, and the words were familiar because Arthur and I had written them together 5 years ago. The bequests were standard and generous. There were endowments for the arts and a trust fund for the grandchildren, if Gideon ever had any, and generous pensions for the long-serving staff. Then came the clause that mattered. Mr. Pendergast read in his monotone voice that the controlling interest of Maison Finch, consisting of 51% of the voting shares, was to pass to me. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. It was done. The factory and the legacy and the name were mine to protect. I looked at Gideon, expecting to see anger or defeat, but instead I saw a small and tight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was the smile of a poker player who knows he is holding a royal flush. Mr. Pendergast moved to close the folder, but Gideon leaned forward and placed his glass on the coaster with a deliberate clink. He spoke softly and apologized for the interruption, but said that there was an addendum. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of cream-colored paper enclosed in a plastic sleeve. He slid it across the desk toward the lawyer and said that his father had signed it 6 months ago during his last bout of illness. The room went very quiet. I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck. Arthur had been ill 6 months ago, yes, but we had been together every moment of every day. He had not signed anything without me present. I watched Mr. Pendergast pick up the document and read it. His eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. He looked over the glasses at me and then back at the paper. He said that this document appeared to be a codicil, which is a legal modification to an existing will. He read the terms aloud, and my blood turned to ice. The codicil stated that in the event of Arthur's death, if his wife, Isadora Finch, was deemed to be in a state of mental fragility or diminished capacity, then the controlling interest of the company would bypass her and go directly to his son, Gideon Finch, who would also assume power of attorney over her personal assets. It was a competency clause. It was a trap designed to strip me of everything the moment I showed a sign of weakness. I stood up, and my legs felt heavy. I demanded to see the paper. Mr. Pendergast hesitated, but then slid the document toward me. I picked it up and held it close to my face. The signature at the bottom was Arthur's scrawl. It had the shaky loop on the F that had developed in his later years due to the arthritis. Visually, it was perfect. A handwriting expert would likely confirm it was his hand. But I am not a handwriting expert. I am a nose. I brought the paper closer to my face and inhaled. The document was dated 6 months ago. Paper that is 6 months old smells dry, and the ink oxidizes and loses its solvent scent. It takes on the smell of the room it is stored in. But this paper did not smell of 6 months ago. It smelled of today. I smelled the sharp and biting scent of fresh ballpoint ink. It was still off-gassing the volatile solvents. It was less than 24 hours old. Underneath the ink, I smelled the faint trace of toner from a laser printer that had been running hot. And beneath that, I smelled Gideon. I smelled the traces of the hand cream he used, and the distinct metallic saltiness of his nervous sweat. He had forged this. He had forged it yesterday, probably while I was at the cemetery visiting Arthur's grave. I looked up at him, and I was shaking with the force of the revelation. I told Mr. Pendergast that this was a forgery. I told him to smell the ink. I told him that the solvents were still fresh and that Arthur could not have signed this 6 months ago because this piece of paper did not exist 6 months ago. Mr. Pendergast looked at me with a mixture of confusion and pity. He leaned in and sniffed the paper tentatively, but he shook his head. He said he smelled nothing unusual. He said it just smelled like paper to him. Gideon stood up then, and he put on a performance that was worthy of an Academy Award. He looked at the lawyer with wet eyes and said that this was exactly what he was afraid of. He said that my obsession with smells was becoming a delusion. He said that I was finding conspiracies in the scent of ink, and that it was a clear sign of the paranoia that came with my condition. My condition. He was using my greatest talent and twisting it into a symptom of madness. He was weaponizing my gift against me. I slammed the paper down on the desk. I told Mr. Pendergast that I would not accept this. I told him that I wanted a forensic analysis of the ink dating. Gideon sighed and shook his head. He said that of course they could do that if I insisted, but it would take months, and in the meantime, the company was in a fragile state and needed steady leadership. He suggested that we invoke the clause immediately to ensure stability while the legal details were sorted out. Mr. Pendergast looked torn. He respected me, but he was looking at a signed legal document and a woman who was screaming about the smell of a pen. He was a lawyer, and he followed the path of least resistance. He told me that for now he had to file the codicil with the probate court. He said that until a judge ruled otherwise the clause was valid. If Gideon could demonstrate that I was unfit, then Gideon was in charge. I looked at my stepson and I saw the triumph in his eyes. He had planned this perfectly. He knew that the more I fought him, the more hysterical I would seem. If I screamed about fake perfumes and smelly paper, I sounded crazy to the outside world. He had built a cage out of my own senses. I picked up my purse and I stood as tall as my 5'4" frame would allow. I told Mr. Pendergast that he was making a mistake. I told him that Arthur would never have signed away my autonomy. Then I turned to Gideon. I spoke in a voice that was low and steady. I told him that ink dries, but the truth does not. I told him that he had made a fatal error because he had underestimated how hard I would fight. I walked out of the library and into the hallway. The house felt different now. It was no longer my home. It was a battlefield. I walked past the portraits of the Finch ancestors on the wall, and I felt like they were watching me. I needed to get out of the house. I needed fresh air. But as I reached for the handle of the front door, I hesitated. If I left now, Gideon would say I was wandering. If I stayed, he would say I was confused. I went to the kitchen instead. The staff were preparing dinner, and the smell of roasting garlic and rosemary usually made me hungry, but today it made my stomach turn. I needed to be careful. If Gideon was willing to forge a will, what else was he willing to do? I realized with a sudden jolt of fear that I was vulnerable. I lived in this massive house with only him and the staff he paid. I went up to my bedroom and locked the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the phone. I needed help. I needed someone who understood the science of what I was saying. I thought of the contacts I had in the industry, but most of them were retired or dead. And then I remembered Renard Dubois. He was my oldest rival. We had fought over contracts and flower fields for 30 years. He was a stubborn and cantankerous old goat, but he had a nose almost as good as mine. If anyone could understand the truth of a smell, it was him. But calling him would be dangerous. If Gideon checked the phone logs, he would know. I decided I had to wait. I had to play the game. I would pretend to be compliant. I would let Gideon think he had won while I looked for a way to prove the forgery. I undressed and got into bed even though it was only 6 p.m. I needed to think, and I did my best thinking in the dark. Lying there in the silence, I smelled the lavender from the fields drifting in through the window. It was the smell of the land I loved. And underneath it, I smelled the faint chemical drift from the factory down the valley. the smell of the fake cœur pur. It was a reminder of what was at stake. I closed my eyes and made a vow to Arthur. I would not let them turn his legacy into a cheap commodity. I would expose Gideon even if I had to sniff out every lie he had ever told one by one. But as sleep finally took me, I did not know that the gaslight was about to be turned up and that my own mind was the next target. The house had always been a living thing to me, and for 40 years it had been a friendly creature. It was a grand old chateau built of limestone that breathed with the seasons. In the summer, it smelled of sun-baked stone and lavender, and in the winter, it smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. I knew every creak of the floorboards and every draft that whistled through the window frames. But in the days following the reading of the codicil, the house began to change. It turned against me. It became a cold and hostile stranger that watched me from the shadows. It started on a Tuesday night, 3 days after Gideon had unveiled his forged document. I had gone to bed early because the tension of living in the same house as my accuser was exhausting. I had locked my bedroom door, as had become my new habit, and I had fallen into a restless sleep. I woke up at 3 in the morning with a start. My heart was pounding and my throat felt tight. I did not hear a noise, but my nose had alerted my brain to danger long before I was fully conscious. I smelled mercaptan. It is the chemical additive put into natural gas to give it that distinctive rotten egg smell, because natural gas is odorless and silent and deadly. The smell was thick and heavy, and it was coming from the hallway. I sat up and the panic seized me. If the concentration was high enough, a single spark could turn the chateau into a crater. I grabbed my robe and fumbled with the lock on my door. I rushed out into the corridor, and the smell was stronger there. It was cloying and sulphurous. I ran down the grand staircase, holding the banister tight because my legs felt shaky. I followed the scent trail through the dining room and the pantry and into the main kitchen. The kitchen was dark, but the smell was overpowering. I flipped the light switch, and my eyes went immediately to the massive industrial gas range that we used for dinner parties. The dial for the front left burner was turned all the way to the open position, but there was no flame. The gas was hissing softly like a snake in the grass. I rushed forward and twisted the knob to the off position. My hands were trembling. I threw open the window above the sink to let the night air rush in. I was gasping for breath and trying to clear the sulfur from my lungs when the kitchen door swung open behind me. It was Gideon. He was wearing his silk pajamas, and he looked remarkably awake for 3 in the morning. He stood in the doorway and sniffed the air, and then he looked at me with wide eyes. He asked me what on earth I was doing. He asked if I was trying to kill us all. I turned to him, and the cool night air hit my back. I told him that I had woken up and smelled the gas. I told him that I came down and found it left on. Gideon walked over to the stove and inspected the dial, and then he looked at me with a tragic expression. He asked me gently if I had come down to make tea. He said that he had heard footsteps earlier, but he assumed I had gone back to bed. I stared at him, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. I told him I had not been downstairs since dinner. I told him I had been asleep. Gideon shook his head slowly. He reached out and touched the kettle that was sitting on the back burner. He said that the kettle was warm. He said that I must have put it on and forgotten to light the pilot and then wandered back upstairs. I touched the kettle. It was stone cold. I looked at him, and I knew he was lying. I smelled the lie on him. It was the scent of anticipation. He was waiting for me to crack. But then Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway behind him. She was wrapped in a flannel robe and her hair was in curlers, and she looked terrified. She asked if everything was all right. Gideon turned to her, and his voice was smooth and reassuring. He told her that everything was fine and that it was just a little accident. He said that Mother had gotten confused and left the gas on, but that we caught it in time. He looked at Mrs. Gable and tapped his temple subtly. It was a gesture so small that I almost missed it, but Mrs. Gable saw it. She looked at me with pity. She looked at me like I was a broken thing that needed to be managed. I tried to protest. I told Mrs. Gable that the kettle was cold and that I had not been in the kitchen. But the more I insisted, the more desperate I sounded. My voice was rising in pitch, and I was waving my hands, and I realized with a sick feeling that I looked exactly like the hysterical old woman Gideon was painting me to be. Gideon put his arm around my shoulders and guided me out of the kitchen. He told Mrs. Gable to open the rest of the windows and that he would take care of me. He led me up the stairs like a prisoner. The next day, the campaign of small terrors continued. I was in the sunroom trying to read a book on botany, but the words were swimming on the page. I heard a crash from the hallway. It was the sound of shattering porcelain. I ran out and saw my favorite Ming vase lying in 1,000 blue and white shards on the parquet floor. It was a vase that Arthur had bought for me in Hong Kong 30 years ago. Gideon was standing there with a dustpan in his hand. He looked up at me and sighed. He asked me why I had tried to move it. He said he had seen me walking down the hall and brushing against the table, and he had called out to me to be careful, but I hadn't stopped. I looked at the table. It was heavy oak. You would have to shove it with significant force to knock that vase over. I told him I had been in the sunroom for an hour. I told him I had not been in the hallway. Gideon just swept up the shards, and the sound of the porcelain scraping against the metal pan was like nails on a chalkboard. He said that forgetting things was normal at my age, but that the denial was worrying him. He said that maybe my spatial awareness was going. I went back to the sunroom, and I sat down, and I trembled. I checked my own memory. Was it possible? Could I have walked down the hall and forgotten it? The gaslight was working. I was starting to doubt the one thing I had always trusted, which was my own mind. I closed my eyes and breathed. I focused on the smells of the room. I smelled the lemon polish on the floor and the dust on the books. I anchored myself in the sensory reality. I knew who I was. I knew I had not knocked over that vase. But the staff was whispering. I could see it in the way the maid avoided my eyes when she brought my lunch. I could smell the fear on them. They were afraid of me because Gideon had told them I was dangerous. He was isolating me in my own home. That evening, Gideon knocked on my bedroom door. He came in without waiting for an answer. He was holding a pamphlet. He sat on the edge of my bed, and he looked at me with that same unbearable kindness. He told me that he had been doing some research. He said that given the incident with the gas in the vase, he was concerned about my safety. He said that he couldn't be here 24 hours a day to watch me. He handed me the pamphlet. It was a glossy brochure for a place called Tranquil Meadows. The cover showed smiling elderly people sitting in a garden. It looked like a resort, but I knew what it was. It was a high-end warehouse for the unwanted. It was a place where inconvenient relatives were parked until they died. Gideon said that the doctor was coming tomorrow to do a cognitive assessment. He said it was just a formality, but that if the doctor agreed, we should consider a trial stay at Tranquil Meadows. Just for a few weeks, he said. Just until I felt more like myself. I looked at the pamphlet and I smelled the glossy paper. It smelled of chemicals and bleach. I looked up at Gideon and I saw the predator behind the mask. He was not going to wait for the courts. He was going to have me committed. He was going to use the doctor to rubber stamp his diagnosis of dementia, and then he would lock me away and sell the company before the ink was dry on the admission papers. I placed the pamphlet on the nightstand. I kept my voice very calm. I told him that I would see the doctor. I told him that I was fine and that the assessment would prove it. Gideon smiled and patted my hand. He said he admired my spirit. He said he hoped I was right. But as he walked to the door, he stopped and turned back. He asked me if I remembered where I put my passport. He said he had been looking for it in the safe, and it was gone. He was doing it again. He was planting the seed of another lost object. I told him my passport was in the drawer of my vanity. He just nodded and said he would check, but he looked doubtful. When he left, I rushed to the vanity and tore open the drawer. The passport was gone. I stood there in the center of my room, and I felt the walls closing in. He had taken my passport. He was systematically stripping me of my identity and my freedom. I realized then that I could not win this game by playing by his rules. If I stayed here and waited for the doctor, I would lose. Gideon controlled the narrative. He controlled the environment, and he probably controlled the doctor. I needed to escape, but I couldn't just run out the front door. He would have the gate code changed. He would have the staff watching me. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast because I had less than 24 hours before the doctor arrived. I went to the window and looked out at the estate. The moon was rising over the lavender fields. The scent of the flowers was faint, but it was there. It was the smell of home. And I decided then and there that I would burn this whole house down before I let him take it from me. I sat down at my desk, and I wrote a letter. It was not a suicide note. It was a statement of facts. I wrote down everything about the fake perfume and the forged will and the gaslight. I folded it and hid it inside the lining of my winter coat. If they took me away, I wanted to make sure that someone would find the truth eventually. But as I hid the letter, I smelled something on the collar of the coat. It was a faint trace of tobacco. Gideon didn't smoke, but the man who ran the security for the estate did. My heart sank. Gideon had the security chief in his pocket too. I was truly alone. I turned off the light and lay in the dark and listened to the house settling. I heard footsteps in the hall outside my door. They stopped and then moved on. He was patrolling. He was waiting. And tomorrow, he was coming for the kill. The sun rose over the Finch estate with a cruel and cheerful brightness that felt like a mockery of the darkness in my own mind. I had slept in my clothes, sitting in the armchair by the window, watching the driveway for the arrival of the doctor. But the driveway remained empty. The appointment was set for noon, which meant I had 4 hours. 4 hours to find something tangible that I could show to an outsider to prove that I was not losing my mind. I washed my face with cold water, and the shock of it helped to clear the fog of sleeplessness. I looked at myself in the mirror, and I saw the dark circles under my eyes and the gray pallor of my skin. I looked exactly like what Gideon wanted me to be. I looked frail. I applied a touch of rouge and a dab of bergamot oil to my wrists because bergamot is the scent of clarity and energy, and I needed both in desperate quantities. I slipped out of my room and the house was quiet. The staff were in the kitchen preparing breakfast, and the smell of toasted bread and brewing coffee drifted up the stairs. But I had no appetite. I needed to get to the orangery. The orangery was a glass-walled structure on the south side of the grounds that Arthur had converted into my private laboratory 30 years ago. It was where I kept the master formulas. We called them the cookbooks. They were hand-bound leather journals containing the exact ratios of every perfume Maison Finch had ever produced, including the real Cœur Pur. If Gideon was swapping out ingredients, he would have to alter the official records to match the invoices, or he would be liable for fraud. If I could get my hands on the current production log, which I kept in the safe in the orangery, I could prove the discrepancy. I could prove that the jasmine absolute on the label was actually a synthetic chemical called Gideon. I walked briskly across the lawn, trying to look like a woman taking a morning stroll rather than a woman running for her life. The morning air was crisp and smelled of damp grass and the distant metallic tang of the factory. I reached the heavy oak doors of the orangery, and I felt a sense of relief. This was my sanctuary. This was the place where I was a queen and a scientist and an artist. I reached into my pocket for my keyring. I selected the small brass key that opened the side door. I slid it into the lock and turned it. Or rather, I tried to turn it. The key stopped halfway. It hit a blockage. I jiggled it, thinking perhaps the tumblers were sticky from the damp morning air, but it would not budge. I pulled it out and looked at the lock. The brass housing was shiny and new. My stomach dropped. He had changed the locks. I stood there staring at the door of my own laboratory, feeling a wave of nausea. I tried the digital keypad next to the main entrance. I punched in my code. 1975. The year I married Arthur. The light on the pad blinked red. I punched it in again, my fingers trembling slightly. Red again. A long, low beep of rejection followed. I stepped back and looked through the glass walls. The interior of the orangery was dimly lit, but I could see my perfume organ. It is a tiered desk where hundreds of small vials of essential oils are arranged in a semicircle like the pipes of a church organ. It stood there in the shadows, calling to me. But between me and my life's work was a pane of reinforced glass and a lock I could not open. Then I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. I smelled him before I heard him. I smelled the crisp scent of dry cleaning starch and the peppermint of his toothpaste. Gideon. I turned slowly. He was standing on the path, his hands in the pockets of his cashmere coat. He looked at the door and then at me, and he shook his head with a sadness that made me want to scream. He asked me what I was doing out here so early. He asked if I was looking for something. I held up my useless key. I kept my voice steady, though it cost me every ounce of will I possessed. I asked him why my key did not work. I asked him why the code had been changed. Gideon sighed and walked closer. He stood between me and the door, effectively blocking my path. He told me that after the incident with the gas stove last night, he had done some thinking. He said that the orangery was full of volatile chemicals, ethanol and aldehydes and flammable oils. He said that if I was having trouble remembering to turn off a stove in the kitchen, he could not in good conscience let me be alone in a room full of explosives. He called it a safety precaution. He said it was for my own protection. I looked at him and I laughed. It was a sharp and bitter sound. I told him that he was very clever. I told him that I knew he wasn't worried about fire. I told him he was worried about what I would find in the safe. I told him I knew he was cooking the books. Gideon's expression did not change. He just looked at me with that maddening pity. He told me that there were no cooked books. He said that the safe contained only old journals and sentimental trinkets. He said that my obsession with this conspiracy was a symptom of my decline. He said that the doctor would explain it all to me later. He reached out and gently took the brass key from my hand. I was so stunned by his audacity that I let him take it. He slipped it into his pocket. He said that he would keep it safe for me until I was well again, until I was stable. I looked at the glass wall of the orangery one last time. I saw a movement inside. It was faint, just a shadow shifting in the back room where the filing cabinets were. I squinted. Someone was inside. I pointed at the glass. I shouted that there was someone in there. I told him to look. Gideon didn't even turn his head. He kept his eyes locked on mine. He said there was no one there, Mother. He said the building was empty. He said I was seeing things again, just like I imagined the smell of the ink. But I knew what I saw. And more importantly, I smelled something drifting from the ventilation grate near the ground. It was a smell that did not belong in a perfumery. It was the smell of bleach, strong industrial bleach. Why would someone be bleaching my lab? Unless they were destroying evidence, unless they were scrubbing the ink from the pages or destroying the old labels. I looked at Gideon and I realized the depths of his thoroughness. He wasn't just locking me out. He was sanitizing the past. He was having someone destroy the records while he kept me distracted on the lawn. I felt a sudden fierce desire to smash the glass with a rock. I wanted to break in and drag the truth out into the light, but I looked at Gideon's face and I saw the anticipation. He wanted me to get violent. He wanted me to throw a rock. If I broke a window, the doctor would arrive to find me amidst shattered glass screaming about conspiracies. It would be the final nail in my coffin. I took a deep breath. I forced my hands to unclench. I told him that he was right. I told him that maybe I was just tired. I lied. I lied with my voice and my body language, but I could not lie with my scent. I knew he could probably smell the cortisol spiking in my sweat, but to him it would just smell like fear. And he liked my fear. I told him I would go back to the house and get ready for the doctor. Gideon smiled, and it was a genuine smile this time because he thought he had broken me. He offered me his arm to walk back to the house. I looked at his arm wrapped in the expensive wool of his coat, and I felt a wave of revulsion. I told him I could walk myself. I turned and walked away from the orangery. I walked away from my life's work. But as I walked, I did not go back to the house immediately. I took a detour through the rose garden. I needed to think. The direct path to the evidence was blocked. The lab was a fortress. The factory was hostile territory. The house was a prison. I sat on a stone bench surrounded by the dying blooms of the autumn roses. They smelled faint and dusty. I closed my eyes and tried to think like a nose. When a scent is too complex, when it is overwhelmed by noise, you have to isolate the notes. You have to find the base note. What was the base note of Gideon's plan? Greed. Yes, but also speed. He was moving very fast. Why? Why the rush? If he had the forgery and he had the power, why risk everything with these dramatic accidents? Why bring the doctor in today? It struck me then. The gala. The 100th anniversary gala was next week. It was the biggest event in the company's history. Investors from all over the world were coming. If I was still in charge, I would be making the speech. I would be meeting the buyers. Gideon needed me gone before the gala. He needed to be the one on that stage announcing the new direction of the company. He needed to sign the deal with the conglomerate before anyone realized the product was fake. That was his timeline. He had 7 days. I opened my eyes. 7 days was not a long time, but it was enough. If I couldn't get the papers, I needed a person. Papers can be shredded and files can be bleached, but people are harder to erase. I thought of the staff at the factory. Most of them were new hires brought in by Gideon, loyal to his paycheck. But there was one man. Silas. Silas Thorne had been the floor manager for 20 years. He was a man of few words who smelled of tobacco and peppermint. He knew where every pipe led and where every drop of oil came from. Gideon had fired him 2 months ago. I had been told he retired to the coast, but I knew Silas. He hated the ocean. He loved the mountains. If Silas was out there, he would know. He might even have copies of the old schedules, but finding him would be impossible from inside the house. Gideon had taken my phone, and he was monitoring the landline. And in 2 hours, the doctor would be here to declare me incompetent. I stood up. I had a new objective. I wasn't going to fight Gideon for the keys to the lab. I was going to let him think he had won the battle for the house. I was going to play the part of the confused old woman so perfectly that he would let his guard down. I would take the test. I would act vague. I would let him talk about tranquil meadows, and then, when the house was quiet and they thought I was sedated, I would run. I walked back to the house with a slow and shuffling gait. I saw Gideon watching me from the library window. I let my shoulders slump. I let him see my defeat. But inside, my mind was sharp and cold. I was not Isadora the victim anymore. I was Isadora the hunter. And I was tracking a scent that led all the way to the truth. I entered the house, and the smell of furniture polish was thick in the air. Mrs. Gable was dusting the banister. She looked at me with sad eyes. I gave her a weak smile. I went up to my room and laid out my outfit for the doctor's visit. A gray dress, sensible shoes, the uniform of a woman who has given up. But under the mattress, I hid the small wad of cash I kept for emergencies. And inside my shoe, I hid the spare key to the old gardening truck that was parked in the back shed. Gideon had forgotten about the truck. It was a rusted old thing we used for hauling mulch, but it ran. And it had a full tank of gas. I sat on the bed and waited for noon. The clock ticked on the mantelpiece. Tick. 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 It was the sound of my life counting down. But it was also the sound of a bomb waiting to go off. Gideon thought he was locking me away. He didn't realize he was locking himself in a cage with a tiger. The doctor's appointment had been postponed. At noon, instead of a medical professional, a courier had arrived with a tuxedo for Gideon and a note for me. The note was brief and written in Gideon's sharp, angular hand. It said that the investors from the Omnicorp group were flying in early and would be joining us for dinner. It was not a request. It was a summons. Gideon was moving up the timeline. He wasn't waiting for a medical certificate to sell the company. He was going to charm the buyers into signing the deal tonight, and he needed me there as a prop. I was to be the silent, nodding matriarch, the living seal of approval on the death warrant of my own legacy. I spent the afternoon in a state of cold, calculated fury. I bathed in water scented with rosemary and lemon to sharpen my mind. I dressed in my favorite evening gown, a midnight blue silk that Arthur had loved, and I draped his pearls around my neck. They felt heavy and cool against my skin, like a protective talisman. I was not going down into that dining room to be a prop. I was going down there to destroy the deal. I would wait until the main course, and then, with the poise of a queen, I would calmly explain to Mr. Kalin and his associates that the current assets of Maison Finch were fraudulent, and that the man sitting at the head of the table was an embezzler. At 7 o'clock, I descended the grand staircase. The house smelled of roasting duck and caramelized figs, a rich and heavy scent that usually signaled celebration, but tonight smelled like a cover-up. The dining room was ablaze with candlelight. The long mahogany table was set with the family silver, and the crystal glasses sparkled like diamonds. Gideon was waiting by the fireplace. He looked handsome and predatory in his tuxedo. He was talking to a tall, silver-haired man and a sharp-eyed woman in a red dress. These were the vultures. Mr. Kalin, the CEO of the conglomerate, and Ms. Mercer, his chief of acquisitions. They smelled of expensive, soulless things. His cologne was a generic mass-market sports scent that cost a fortune but had no heart, and hers was a powdery iris that was too strong, intended to dominate a room rather than seduce it. Gideon saw me and smiled. It was the smile of a ringmaster introducing a trained bear. He came forward and took my hand, his grip firm and warning. He introduced me to the guests. Mr. Kalin kissed my hand and murmured something about the honor of meeting a legend. I looked him in the eye and saw only calculation. He wasn't looking at a legend, he was looking at a depreciating asset. "Mother," Gideon said, his voice dripping with solicitude. "You look tired. I took the liberty of asking Mrs. Gable to brew you a cup of your special herbal blend, just to settle your nerves before we eat." He gestured to a side table where a delicate porcelain cup sat on a saucer. Steam curled up from it, carrying the strong, medicinal scent of valerian root and peppermint. I hesitated. I knew that scent. I drank it, occasionally when insomnia struck. It was pungent enough to mask almost anything. "I think I'll have wine," I said, my voice steady. Gideon's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "Now, Mother, remember what the doctor said about alcohol and your medication. Please. For me." The room went silent. The guests were watching. If I refused, I would look difficult, perhaps even erratic. If I drank it, I played the part of the compliant invalid. I looked at the cup. I leaned in slightly. I smelled the peppermint, the earthy funk of the valerian. I did not smell anything else. No bitter almond of cyanide, no metallic tang of arsenic. Whatever he had put in there, if anything, was odorless or buried deep under the herbs. I decided to take the risk. I needed to appear cooperative so that when I dropped the bomb about the fraud, they would believe me. I picked up the cup. I took a sip. It was hot and strong. I took another. Gideon watched me swallow, and for a split second, I saw his shoulders relax. That should have been my warning. We sat at the table. The first course was a lobster bisque. The conversation was light and meaningless. Mr. Kalin spoke about the synergy of merging our brands. Ms. Mercer complimented the house. I waited. I was biding my time. "The history of Maison Finch is one of purity," Gideon said, raising his glass of wine. "We have never compromised on ingredients. That is what you are buying, the integrity of the process." That was my cue. I placed my spoon down. The silver clicked against the china, a sharp sound that cut through the chatter. "That is an interesting choice of words, Gideon," I said. I turned to Mr. Kalin. "Integrity. It is a word my husband valued above all else, which is why I feel it is my duty to inform you that the integrity of our current stock is compromised." I felt a sudden wave of heat wash over me. It started at the base of my skull and rolled down my spine. My tongue felt suddenly thick in my mouth. "Mother," Gideon said, his voice low. "Please." "No," I said, pushing through the heat. "I will not be silent. The jasmine. The jasmine in Vought 4. I tried to say synthetic, but the word got stuck. My lips felt numb, as if I had been to the dentist. The room gave a sudden, violent lurch to the left. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself. The candlelight smeared into long, blurry streaks. "Is she all right?" Ms. Mercer asked, her voice sounding like it was coming from underwater. I am fine," I tried to say, but it came out as a slur. "I am just... the tea." I looked at Gideon. He was sitting perfectly still, watching me with a look of tragic resignation. He hadn't used a poison. He had used a muscle relaxant or a powerful benzodiazepine, something that didn't kill but disconnected the brain from the mouth. He had hidden it under the valerian, knowing the heavy root smell would cover the chemical dust. "I apologize," Gideon said to the guests, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Her condition has been deteriorating rapidly this week. The confusion, the sundowning, it's very difficult." "I am not confused," I shouted, or I thought I shouted. In reality, it was a garbled moan. I tried to stand up, to assert my dignity, but my legs were made of lead. I swayed and knocked over my water glass. The cold water soaked the tablecloth, spreading like a dark stain. "Oh dear," Mr. Kalin said, pulling back his chair. He looked at me with open pity now. The respect was gone. He saw a drooling, stumbling old woman who couldn't hold her liquor or her bladder. "I think it's time for bed, Mother," Gideon said. He was at my side instantly. He gripped my arm, his fingers digging into the soft flesh. "I've got you." "You drugged me," I whispered, leaning my weight against him because I had no choice. "Shh," he soothed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's just a spell. You're tired." He practically dragged me out of the dining room. I looked back at the investors. Mr. Kalin was dabbing his napkin on the wet tablecloth, already turning back to his conversation with Ms. Mercer. They had dismissed me. I was no longer a factor in the deal. I was just a tragic backstory. Gideon marched me into the hallway, out of sight of the guests. The moment the door closed, his gentleness vanished. He shoved me toward the stairs. I stumbled and caught the banister. "You are pathetic," he hissed, his face close to mine. I could smell the wine on his breath and the triumph in his pores. "Did you really think you could outsmart me? You're a relic, Isadora, a dusty old bottle on a shelf that nobody wants anymore." I tried to spit at him, to claw his face, but my hands wouldn't obey. The hallway was spinning. The portraits of the ancestors seemed to be laughing. "Mrs. Gable!" Gideon shouted. The housekeeper appeared from the shadows, wringing her hands. "Take her to her room," Gideon ordered. "Lock the door, and if she makes a sound, give her another dose of the tea. The doctor will be here in the morning to finalize the transfer." "Transfer?" I managed to wheeze. "To Tranquil Meadows," Gideon said, adjusting his cufflinks. "You proved tonight that you can't be trusted in polite society. You need professional help, and I need to sell this company without you embarrassing me again." Mrs. Gable took my other arm. She was crying silently. I could smell her tears, salty and metallic. She knew this was wrong, but she was afraid for her job. She was afraid of him. They half carried me up the stairs. My feet dragged on the carpet. I felt a tear slide down my own cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, impotent rage. He had taken my voice. He had taken my dignity. And tomorrow, he was going to take my freedom. I was deposited onto my bed. The door clicked shut. I heard the lock turn. I lay there in the dark, the silk dress bunched around me, paralyzed by the chemistry in my blood. I could hear the laughter from the dining room downstairs. They were toasting. They were celebrating the end of Isadora Finch. But as I lay there, fighting the darkness pulling me under, I focused on one thing: the smell of Gideon's triumph. It was premature. He had made a mistake. He had left me alive. And as long as I had breath in my lungs and a nose on my face, I was not finished. The drug would wear off. And when it did, I wouldn't be the polite stepmother anymore. I would be the storm he never smelled coming. The morning light that filtered through the heavy velvet curtains did not bring hope. It brought a headache that felt like a chisel being driven into the base of my skull. I woke up fully clothed in my midnight blue evening gown, which was now wrinkled and twisted around my legs like a shroud. My mouth tasted of cotton and bitter metal, which was the lingering aftertaste of the sedative Gideon had slipped into my tea. I tried to sit up, but the room tilted dangerously, and I had to grip the mattress to keep from falling off the edge of the world. I was not just hungover, I was chemically subdued. My limbs felt heavy and disconnected from my brain, as if I were operating a puppet with tangled strings. I looked at the clock on the bedside table, and it was 10 in the morning. I had lost 12 hours. 12 hours in which Gideon had likely finalized the deal with the investors while I lay here drooling on my pillow. The lock on my door clicked. It was a sharp and mechanical sound that signaled the start of the next act in Gideon's play. The door opened and my stepson walked in. He was fresh and groomed and smelled of sandalwood and victory. Behind him walked a man I did not know. He was short and balding, with a nervous energy that made him twitch. He carried a black leather medical bag, and he smelled of antiseptic and stale cigarette smoke and something else. Something sour and desperate. Gideon introduced him as Dr. Vane. He said that Dr. Vane was a specialist in geriatric cognitive decline and that he was here to assess my fitness. I looked at Dr. Vane and I did not see a specialist. I saw a man who bought his suits off the rack and wore a watch that was too expensive for a doctor on a hospital salary. He smelled of debt. It is a distinct scent composed of stress sweat and the musk of a man who is constantly looking over his shoulder. Gideon had bought him. I was certain of it. Dr. Vane pulled a chair close to the bed and clicked a pen. He did not look me in the eye. He looked at my forehead or my chin, but never my eyes. He asked me to state my name and the date. My tongue felt thick, but I forced the words out. I told him my name was Isadora Finch. I told him the date. I told him that I was the owner of this house and that I was being held against my will. Dr. Vane scribbled on his clipboard. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I started to do it. 93, 86, 79. But at 72 I faltered because a wave of nausea rolled over me. I closed my eyes to steady myself. Gideon sighed loudly from the doorway. He told the doctor that this was typical. He said that I often lost my train of thought and became confused when pressed. He said that last night I had become violent and delusional at a dinner party. I snapped my eyes open. I looked at the doctor and told him that I was drugged. I told him to take a blood sample. I told him that if he tested my blood right now, he would find benzodiazepines that I did not prescribe for myself. Dr. Vane paused. He looked at Gideon. Gideon just nodded slowly and sadly. Dr. Vane turned back to me and shone a penlight into my eyes. The light was blinding and painful. He told me that paranoia was a common symptom of the condition. He said that patients often believed their caregivers were poisoning them. He said it was a projection of their own internal chaos. He didn't take any blood, He didn't check my blood pressure. He didn't ask me about my medical history. He just wrote on his paper, tick, tick, tick. Every check mark was a bar in the cell they were building for me. Then he did something that made my skin crawl. He leaned in close to check my pulse, and I smelled him properly. Under the smoke and the antiseptic was the smell of a woman's perfume. It was cheap and floral, and it clung to his collar. And beneath that was the smell of bourbon. At 10 in the morning, this man was not a doctor, he was a wreck. He was a rubber stamp with a medical license. He stood up and closed his folder. He turned to Gideon and spoke as if I were not in the room. He said that the presentation was consistent with advanced rapid onset dementia with paranoid features. He said that home care was no longer a viable option given the safety risks I posed to myself and others. He recommended immediate transfer to a secure facility. Gideon nodded solemnly. He asked if Tranquil Meadows would be suitable. Dr. Vane agreed that it was the best facility in the state and that he would sign the necessary committal papers immediately. I sat there on the bed, and I felt a cold numbness spreading through my chest. It wasn't the drug anymore. It was the shock of absolute powerlessness. They were discussing my life as if I were a piece of broken furniture that needed to be moved to storage. Dr. Vane left the room quickly like a man escaping a crime scene. Gideon stayed behind. He walked over to the window and looked out at the lavender fields. He told me that he had made the arrangements. He said that a van from Tranquil Meadows would be here in 48 hours. He said he was giving me 2 days to pack my things and say goodbye to the house because he wasn't a monster. He turned to look at me and his face was blank. He said that he hoped I understood that this was for the best. He said that the company needed strong leadership and the estate was too much for me to manage. He said that at Tranquil Meadows, I could just relax and smell the flowers. I looked at him, and I saw the boy I had raised. I saw the shadow of the husband I had loved, and I realized that both of them were dead. The thing standing in front of me was a creature of pure ambition. I asked him one question. I asked him if he even knew what the heart note of cœur pour was. Gideon frowned. He said it didn't matter. He said it was just a product. That was the moment I knew he had to be destroyed, not just stopped, but destroyed. He didn't just want my money, he wanted to erase the art that Arthur and I had created. He was going to turn our legacy into a generic commodity. Gideon left the room and left the door unlocked. He didn't need to lock it anymore. He had the doctor's signature. I was legally incompetent. If I ran away now, the police would just bring me back. I was trapped. I stood up and walked to the mirror. I looked at the old woman staring back at me. Her hair was messy, and her dress was ruined, and her eyes were red. I looked like a victim. But then I leaned closer to the glass. I breathed in deep. I smelled the bergamot I had applied yesterday. It was faint, but it was still there. The scent of clarity. I had 48 hours, 2 days. It wasn't much time, but it was enough to disappear. If I stayed, I would die in a white room smelling of bleach and urine. If I ran, I might lose everything, but at least I would be free. I began to strip off the ruined evening gown. I put on sturdy trousers and a wool sweater. I moved mechanically, but my mind was racing. I needed money. I needed a vehicle, and I needed the evidence. The evidence was still in the orangery locked in the safe. I couldn't get into the orangery. Gideon had the key. But then I remembered something. The ventilation system. The orangery was built in the 19th century, but Arthur had retrofitted it with a modern climate control system for the flowers. The intake vents were large enough for a person to crawl through if that person was small and desperate. I wasn't going to pack my bags for tranquil meadows. I was going to pack a survival kit. I found my old hiking backpack in the back of the closet. I put in a change of clothes, a flashlight, a bottle of water, and a small knife. I took the wad of cash from under the mattress. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and waited for nightfall. The house was silent. The staff were avoiding the upstairs hallway because they knew what was happening. They were ashamed. I was the ghost in the attic. As the sun began to set, the shadows lengthened across the floor. I felt a strange calm settle over me. It was the calm of having nothing left to lose. Gideon thought he had won. He thought the game was over. But he had forgotten the first rule of perfumery. The volatile notes evaporate first, but the base notes, the heavy resins, and the deep woods, they last forever. I was a base note. I was stubborn and thick, and I would linger long after he thought I was gone. I waited until the grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight. Then I opened my door. The hallway was empty. I could smell Gideon's cigar smoke coming from the library downstairs. He was celebrating. Good. Let him get drunk on his victory. I crept down the back stairs, the servants' stairs that Gideon never used because they were too narrow for his ego. I slipped out the kitchen door and into the cool night air. The wind was blowing from the north, carrying the scent of rain. I looked toward the orangery. It glowed faintly in the moonlight. My destination. I wasn't leaving this estate without the proof. I was going to crawl through the dirt and the ducks to get it. And then I was going to run. The darkness of the estate was not total because the moon was fighting a losing battle against a bank of heavy storm clouds rolling in from the west. I could smell the rain coming. It smelled of wet slate and bruised ozone, and it was a scent I usually loved. But tonight, it just meant that the roads would be slick and the visibility poor. I crouched behind the thick hedge of rhododendrons that bordered the south lawn and tried to slow my breathing. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and the wool sweater I was wearing felt itchy and hot despite the chill in the air. I checked my watch, and the luminous hands showed 12:15. Gideon was likely on his second brandy in the library, or perhaps he had gone to bed secure in the knowledge that his stepmother was locked in her room and sedated. He did not know that I had picked the lock of my bedroom door with a hairpin 30 years ago, when Arthur lost the key, and I had never forgotten the trick. He also did not know that the sedative he gave me was mostly neutralized by the charcoal tablets I had swallowed immediately after dinner. I was not groggy anymore. I was terrified, but I was awake. I moved across the open stretch of lawn toward the orangery. I stayed low, keeping to the shadows of the topiaries. The wet grass soaked through my trousers and the cold seeped into my knees, but I did not stop. I reached the side of the glass building and pressed my back against the brick foundation. The ventilation intake was hidden behind a trellis of climbing roses. The thorns tore at my jacket as I pushed the vines aside, but I did not feel the pain. I found the grate. It was an iron grid set into the brickwork near the ground. I pulled a small screwdriver from my pocket, which I had taken from a repair kit in the kitchen drawer. The screws were rusted and stubborn. I leaned my weight into the handle and grunted softly as the first screw gave way with a screech of protesting metal. I froze and waited. The silence of the night remained unbroken save for the hoot of an owl. I turned the second screw and then the third. Finally, the grate came loose and I set it gently on the grass. The opening was dark and smelled of dust and dry rot, and the metallic tang of galvanized steel. It was a tight squeeze. I am a small woman, but I am not a contortionist. I pushed my backpack in first, and then I lay on my stomach and wriggled into the hole. The metal was cold against my stomach, and the air was stale. I crawled forward on my elbows, dragging my body through the narrow tunnel. It was claustrophobic and dark, and for a moment I felt a wave of panic rising in my throat. I imagined getting stuck here and dying in the wall like a rat. But then I smelled it. A faint draft coming from the vent ahead carried the scent of rose absolute and alcohol. It was the smell of my lab. It was the smell of my life. I pushed forward until I reached the interior vent cover. This one was held in place by simple clips. I pushed it open and tumbled out onto the floor of the prep room. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath. The room was dark, but the moonlight filtering through the glass roof turned everything into a ghostly silver. I stood up and brushed the dust from my clothes. The air in here was different than usual. As I had suspected earlier, it smelled heavily of industrial bleach. Gideon had ordered a deep clean. He was trying to scrub away the history of the place. I moved quickly to the main workroom. My perfume organ stood in the shadows like a silent witness. I walked past it to the large steel safe in the corner. This was an old safe, a relic from the 19th century that Arthur had refused to replace with a digital one because he said he liked the weight of the tumblers. Gideon hated this safe because he never had the patience to learn the combination. He relied on me to open it. I knelt in front of the dial. My fingers were trembling, so I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. I needed to focus. Right to 35, left to 12, right to 78. I felt the clicks more than I heard them. The mechanism was heavy and smooth. I turned the handle and the heavy door swung open with a groan. I shone my flashlight inside. The shelves were mostly empty. Gideon had cleared out the cash box and the deeds, but in the back corner, pushed behind a stack of old tax returns, was what I needed. The black book. It was a thick leather ledger where Arthur and I had recorded every formula and every supplier deviation for 40 years. It contained the chemical fingerprint of the real cœur pur. I grabbed the book and shoved it into my backpack. Then I reached for the small wooden box on the top shelf. Inside was a crystal vial sealed with wax. This was the master sample. It was from the very first batch of cœur pur ever made. It was the gold standard against which all other batches were measured. If I was going to prove Gideon's product was a fake, I needed this for the comparison. I wrapped the vial in a cloth and tucked it safely into the bag. I had what I came for. Now I had to get out. I couldn't go back through the vent. I went to the side door, the one Gideon had locked. From the inside, it had a manual thumb turn. I unlocked it and opened it slowly. The hinges squeaked, and the sound seemed to echo across the entire valley. I stepped out into the night, and the wind hit me hard. The storm had arrived. Fat drops of rain were starting to fall, hitting the glass roof of the orangery like bullets. I ran toward the gardening shed located near the perimeter wall. The mud sucked at my shoes and the rain plastered my hair to my skull. I was cold and wet, and I felt every year of my age, but I kept running. I reached the shed and slipped inside. It smelled of gasoline and fertilizer and old oil. In the center of the cluttered space sat the beast. It was a 30-year-old pickup truck that the groundskeepers used for hauling mulch. It was rusted and ugly, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I climbed into the driver's seat The upholstery smelled of mildew and stale tobacco. I fished the spare key from my shoe and jammed it into the ignition. I prayed to whatever gods watch over old women and old trucks. I turned the key. The engine cranked. Chug, chug, chug. It didn't catch. I cursed under my breath. "Come on," I whispered. "Don't you die on me now." I pumped the gas pedal and turned the key again. Chug, chug, roar. The engine exploded into life with a noise that sounded like a gunshot followed by a rock slide. It was deafening. There was no way they didn't hear that at the main house. I threw the truck into gear and slammed my foot on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward and smashed through the wooden doors of the shed, splintering the rotten wood like matchsticks. I fishtailed onto the gravel service road and gunned it toward the rear service gate. I looked in the rearview mirror. The lights in the main house were flicking on. First the library, then the hall, then Gideon's bedroom. He was awake. He heard the beast waking up. The service gate was a simple chain-link barrier. It was usually padlocked, but I didn't have time to check. I gripped the steering wheel tight and braced for impact. The truck hit the gate with a metallic screech, and the chain snapped. The gate swung open, and I bounced out onto the public road. I didn't look back. I drove into the darkness with the rain lashing against the windshield. The wipers were old, and they shrieked against the glass, smearing the water rather than clearing it. I was driving blind on a winding country road in a storm in a stolen truck. My heart was racing so fast, I thought it might stop. I was a fugitive. Isadora Finch, the respected matriarch, the nose of the century, was now a thief in the night. Gideon would call the police. He would tell them I had stolen a vehicle. He would tell them I was dangerous. He would have an APB out for me within the hour. I needed to get off the main road. I needed to get to Renard. He lived 20 miles away on the other side of the valley. His estate was a fortress of solitude, and he hated the police almost as much as he hated Gideon. If I could get to Renard, he would hide me. I drove for 10 miles, my knuckles white on the wheel. Every time a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, I held my breath, terrified it was a patrol car. But the road remained empty, save for the rain. The truck smelled of burning oil and exhaust fumes leaking into the cabin. It was a noxious smell, but to me, it smelled like freedom. I reached over and patted the backpack on the passenger seat. I had the book. I had the sample. I had the truth. But as I rounded a sharp bend, the truck's engine sputtered. The roar turned into a cough. I looked at the fuel gauge. It was bouncing near empty. I had checked it months ago, but the staff must have been using it for short trips without refilling it. Panic flared again. I was 5 miles from Renard's gate. If the truck died here on the open road, I was a sitting duck. I whispered to the truck again, begging it to hold on. I stroked the dashboard like it was a living thing. "Just a little further," I said. "Just get me to the ridge." The engine coughed again, and the truck jerked, but it kept rolling. I could see the lights of the next village in the valley below. I bypassed the turnoff and headed up the steep incline toward Reynard's flower fields. The truck groaned on the hill, losing speed. 30 miles an hour. 20. 10. We crested the hill, and I let gravity take over. I coasted down the other side, the engine idling roughly. I saw the stone pillars of Renard's driveway ahead. I turned the wheel, and the truck shuddered as we hit the cobblestones. I drove up the long avenue of cypress trees and pulled up in front of his house. It was dark. Renard was an early riser, but he was also an early sleeper. I killed the engine, and the silence that rushed back in was overwhelming. I sat there for a moment shaking. I had done it. I had escaped the asylum. I grabbed my bag and climbed out of the truck. My legs were jelly. I walked to the massive oak door and lifted the heavy iron knocker. I let it fall. Boom, boom, boom. I waited. The rain soaked through my sweater, chilling me to the bone. After what felt like an eternity, a light flicked on above the door. The heavy bolts were drawn back. The door opened, and Renard Dubois stood there. He was wearing a silk dressing gown and holding a candelabra, which was absurdly dramatic, but very Renard. He looked at me standing there in the rain, looking like a drowned rat with a backpack. He sniffed the air. He smelled the diesel and the fear and the rain on my skin. His eyes narrowed.
"Isadora," he grunted, "you smell like a mechanic who has been swimming in a swamp. What in God's name are you doing here?"
I looked at my old enemy, and I felt the tears finally start to fall. "I need a sanctuary, Renard," I said, "and I have the formula." Renard looked at me for a long second, then he looked past me at the dark driveway to see if I was followed. He stepped back and opened the door wider.
"Get in," he said, "before you drip on my foyer."
I stepped inside and heard the heavy lock slide home behind me. I was safe. For now. But I knew the war had only just begun. The foyer of Renard Dubois's estate was everything that the Finch house was not. Where my home was airy and filled with the light floral scents of the Valley, Renard's home was a cavern of masculinity and brooding history. It smelled of beeswax polish and heavy velvet drapes and the lingering smoke of the Turkish tobacco he had insisted on smoking for 40 years, despite his doctor's warnings. It was a warm and heavy scent that wrapped around you like a wool blanket. And for the first time in a week, I felt my shoulders drop away from my ears. Renard did not offer me a hug because we were not hugging people. We were competitors who had spent decades outbidding each other for the best crops of tuberose and grass. Instead, he pointed a gnarled finger toward the drawing room and told me to go sit by the fire before I dripped on his Persian rug. I walked into the room, and the heat from the massive stone fireplace hit me like a physical embrace. I dropped my wet backpack on a leather armchair and collapsed onto the sofa. I was shivering violently now that the adrenaline was fading and the cold reality of my situation was setting in. Renard disappeared for a moment and returned with a heavy crystal tumbler filled with an amber liquid. He shoved it into my hand without a word. I took a sip, and the fire of vintage Armagnac burned all the way down my throat. It tasted of dried plums and oak, and it was exactly what I needed to restart my heart. Renard sat in the wingback chair opposite me and watched me with eyes that were dark and sharp, like a hawk's. He waited until the color returned to my cheeks before he spoke. He asked me simply what the boy had done. He did not ask if I was crazy or if I had imagined it. He called Gideon the boy, with a disdain that he had cultivated since Gideon was in short pants. I told him everything. I told him about the synthetic jasmine in vat 4. I told him about the forged codicil and the smell of the fresh ink. I told him about the gaslight and the vase and the doctor who smelled of bourbon. I told him how Gideon was planning to lock me away in a place called Tranquil Meadows so he could sell the company to Omnicorp before the gala. Renard listened without interrupting, which was a rare thing for him. He sat with his steepled fingers resting against his chin and his eyes narrowed in thought. When I finished, I leaned back and waited for his verdict. I was terrified that he would tell me I was overwrought. I was terrified that he would call Gideon. Instead, Renard let out a long and ragged sigh. He reached into his smoking jacket and pulled out a silver case. He lit a cigarette, and the blue smoke curled into the air, adding a note of acrid sharpness to the room. He told me that he was not surprised. He said that he had always known Gideon had the soul of an accountant, not a perfumer. He said that an accountant looks at a field of lavender and sees a spreadsheet, but a perfumer sees a miracle. He stood up and walked to a heavy oak cabinet in the corner of the room. He unlocked it and pulled out a small blue bottle. My heart skipped a beat because I recognized the shape instantly. It was a bottle of Cœur Pur. But it was a new bottle. The label was shiny, and the glass lacked the subtle imperfections of our older stock. Renard placed the bottle on the low table between us. He told me that he had bought this 3 days ago. He said that he had heard rumors in the industry that the Finch quality was slipping, and he wanted to see for himself if the great Isadora Finch had finally lost her touch. He admitted that for a moment he had been happy about it. He thought maybe I was just getting old and lazy. I looked at the bottle and I felt a surge of defensive anger. I told him that I had never been lazy in my life. I reached into my damp backpack and pulled out the wax-sealed vial I had stolen from the safe. I placed the master sample next to the store-bought bottle. The difference was stark, even in the packaging. The old vial was hand-blown glass stoppered with cork and wax. The new bottle was machine-molded. Renard looked at the two vessels, and a gleam of professional curiosity entered his eyes. He said that we should put it to the test. He went to his desk and retrieved a box of professional scent strips. These were long strips of absorbent white paper that we used to analyze the evolution of a fragrance over time. He handed me a strip and took one for himself. We were not just two old people in a drawing room anymore. We were scientists. We were artists. I opened the master sample first. I broke the wax seal with my thumbnail and uncorked the vial. The scent that rose from it was immediate and powerful. It filled the space between us with the rich and heady aroma of absolute purity. It smelled of the sun in the south of France in 1985. It smelled of real ambergris and jasmine that had been picked at dawn. It was complex and living, and it evolved in the air like a piece of music. Renard closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. A look of genuine reverence crossed his face. He whispered that it was a masterpiece. He said he had forgotten how good it really was. Then I capped the vial and we turned to the blue bottle. Renard broke the seal and sprayed a fine mist onto the second strip. The difference was like stepping from a garden into a sterile hospital corridor. The initial hit was sharp and cloying. It was loud. That is the only way to describe it. It screamed for attention with high-pitched aldehydes, but there was no depth. Renard waved the strip under his nose and grimaced. He said it smelled flat. He said it lacked the vibration of the natural oils. But then he frowned and brought the strip closer. He sniffed again with short, sharp inhalations. He asked me if I smelled the fixative. I took the strip from him. I focused past the synthetic floral notes and drilled down into the base. There was a chemical aftertaste that coated the back of my throat. It was bitter and metallic. I knew that smell. It was a cheap industrial fixative called phthalate diethyl. It was used to make the scent last longer on the skin, but it was a known irritant. It was banned in high-end perfumery. Using it in Cœur Pur was not just cheap, it was a betrayal of the consumer's trust. But then I smelled something else. Something buried under the phthalates. It was a faint, acidic tang that made my nose prickle. I looked at Renard and saw that he had detected it too. He went to his desk and pulled out a magnifying glass and a portable mass spectrometer, which was the size of a toaster. Renard was old-fashioned in his style, but he kept his lab equipment state-of-the-art. He took a sample from the blue bottle and fed it into the machine. We waited in silence while the digital display flickered. The machine was breaking down the molecular composition of the liquid. After 2 minutes, a graph appeared on the screen. Renard studied the peaks and valleys of the graph, and his face went pale. He pointed to a spike in the middle of the readout. He asked me if I knew what that compound was. I looked at the chemical signature. It was a derivative of bergaptan. Bergaptan is found in natural bergamot oil, but it is phototoxic, which means that if you put it on your skin and go out into the sun, it causes severe burns and blistering. We always used bergamot that had the bergaptan removed. It was an expensive process called rectification. Gideon had skipped the rectification. He was using raw, unrefined bergamot oil to save money. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. This wasn't just about quality anymore. This was dangerous. If a woman sprayed this on her neck and went out for a summer lunch, she could end up with second-degree chemical burns. Gideon was selling a weapon in a crystal bottle. I looked at Renard and told him that we had to stop this. I told him that this wasn't just fraud, it was negligence. Renard nodded slowly. He said that if this got out, it would not just destroy Maison Finch, it would destroy the reputation of the entire region. He said that the Omnicorp people were fools, but they were not criminals. If they knew they were buying a liability like this, they would run for the hills. Renard poured himself another drink and looked at me with a new respect. He said that I had been right to run. He said that Gideon was desperate. A man who cuts corners like this is a man who is drowning in debt. He asked me if I knew why Gideon needed the money so badly. I shook my head. I had always assumed it was just greed. But Renard tapped the table with his finger. He said that the grapevine has ears. He said he had heard whispers that Gideon had made some bad investments in cryptocurrency and overseas real estate. He said the boy was leveraged to the hilt. He needed the Omnicorp buyout not to get rich, but to stay out of prison for his other debts. It all made sense. The rush, the forgery, the cheap ingredients. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, and I was Peter. Renard looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was 3 a.m. He told me that I was safe here. He said that his gates were locked and his dogs were loose, and that Gideon would not dare set foot on his property. He said we had work to do tomorrow. We needed to organize the evidence. We needed to find Silas. I asked him why he was helping me. We had been enemies for 30 years. I had stolen his best head chemist in 1995. He had sued me over a bottle design in 2002. Renard looked at the fire and swirled his brandy. He said that we were the last of the dinosaurs, Isadora. He said that the world was moving on to influencers and celebrity brands and synthetic trash. He said that people like Gideon didn't understand that perfume is a memory. He said that he would be damned if he let a bean counter destroy the work of a generation just to pay off a gambling debt. He looked at me and smiled a crooked smile. He said that besides, he had always liked a good fight. And he said that I looked terrible and that I should go to sleep before I frightened his housekeeper. I stood up and felt the weight of the night pressing down on me. But I also felt something else. I felt the strength of an alliance. I was not alone anymore. I had a fortress. I had a witness, and I had the scientific proof that Gideon was selling poison. Renard showed me to a guest room that smelled of lavender sheets and old wood. I locked the door out of habit, but then I unlocked it. I trusted Renard. He was a shark, but he was an honest shark. I lay down in the bed and listened to the rain hammering against the window. The storm was raging outside, but inside my mind, the fog was clearing. I knew what I had to do. I had to find Silas and get the invoices that matched the poison in that bottle. And then I had to crash a party. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a week, I slept without dreaming of gas or cages. I slept the deep sleep of a soldier who has found a trench. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the morning air scrubbed clean and sharp. I woke up in Renard's guest room, and for a moment I did not know where I was, because the sheets smelled of lavender detergent that was not my own, but then the memory of the flight and the stolen truck and the toxic perfume came rushing back. I did not feel the crushing weight of fear that had been my constant companion for the last week. Instead, I felt a cold and crystalline sense of purpose. I was no longer the confused widow trapped in a gaslit house. I was Isadora Finch, and I was going to war. I went downstairs to the kitchen, where Renard was already awake and drinking espresso from a tiny porcelain cup. He was dressed in a sharp tweed suit that looked like it belonged in a hunting lodge from the last century, and he smelled of shaving soap and anticipation. On the table between us lay the map of the valley. Renard did not waste time with pleasantries. He simply pointed to a spot in the foothills of the Jura Mountains, where the terrain was rugged and the roads were barely paved. He told me that his sources confirmed that Silas Thorne had not moved to the coast, as the official company memo had stated, but had retreated to his family's old hunting cabin up in the timberline. I looked at the map, and I nodded, because it made sense. Silas was a man of the earth who smelled of cured tobacco and pine resin, and he hated the salt air of the ocean because he said it dulled the palate. If he was hiding, he would hide where the air was thin and clear. Renard tossed me a set of keys and told me that we were taking his car, because the beast I had arrived in was likely to explode if we tried to drive it up a mountain. We took Renard's vintage Jaguar, which smelled of old leather and gasoline and money. The drive up the valley was silent, but it was a comfortable silence born of a shared mission. As we climbed higher, the vineyards and the lavender fields gave way to dense forests of spruce and fir. The air grew colder and thinner, and I rolled down the window to let the scent of the damp forest fill the cabin. It smelled of wet moss and decaying leaves and the secret life of fungi. It was a smell that Silas loved. We found the turnoff after an hour of driving. It was a dirt track that wound its way up a steep incline, almost hidden by the overgrowth. Renard navigated the ruts with a surprising amount of skill for a man who usually had a chauffeur. We came to a clearing, and there sat the cabin. It was a small structure made of rough-hewn logs, with smoke curling lazily from the stone chimney. We got out of the car, and the silence of the mountains was profound. I walked toward the door, and I smelled him before I saw him. The air around the cabin was thick with the scent of cherry Cavendish pipe tobacco. It was a sweet and heavy smell that I associated with 20 years of production meetings and late nights in the lab. Silas was here. I knocked on the heavy wooden door. There was no answer, but I heard the floorboards creak inside. I knocked again, louder this time. I called out his name. I told him it was Isadora and that I needed his help. The door opened a crack, and a shotgun barrel appeared, followed by the suspicious face of Silas Thorne. He looked older than I remembered. His beard was grayer and unkempt, and his eyes were rimmed with red as if he had not slept well in months. He looked from me to Renard, and then back to me. He lowered the gun, but he did not open the door any wider. He asked me what I was doing here. He asked if Gideon had sent me to finish the job. I told him that Gideon had sent me to an asylum. I told him that I had escaped, and that I was here because he was the only man who knew where the bodies were buried. Silas looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the anger warring with the curiosity in his eyes. He stepped back and opened the door. The inside of the cabin was dark and cluttered. It smelled of wood smoke and stale coffee and the distinct musk of a man living alone with his grievances. Piles of newspapers and old scientific journals were stacked on every surface. Silas cleared a space on the battered sofa and gestured for us to sit. He remained standing by the fireplace, packing his pipe with trembling fingers. He told us that he knew something was wrong the moment Gideon took over. He said that the boy had started cutting budgets within a week of Arthur's funeral. He said that he had tried to warn Gideon about the supply chain integrity, but Gideon had laughed at him and told him that he was an expensive relic. Silas said that when he was fired, he was given a non-disclosure agreement and a severance package that was barely enough to keep the heat on. I looked at my old floor manager and I felt a pang of guilt. I had been so wrapped up in my own grief over Arthur that I had failed to protect the people who had built the company with us. I apologized to him. I told him that I should have fought harder for him. Silas shrugged and lit his match. The sulfur flared, and then the sweet smoke filled the room. He said that water was under the bridge, and he asked what I wanted from him now. Renard spoke up then. He placed the blue bottle of fake Perfumer on the rustic coffee table. He told Silas to smell it. Silas looked at the bottle with disdain, but he picked it up. He sprayed a little into the air and sniffed. His reaction was immediate. He recoiled as if he had been slapped. He named the chemical compounds instantly, just as I had. He identified the Gideon and the lack of natural indole. But then he frowned and sniffed again. He looked at me with wide eyes. He asked if that was bergaptan. I nodded. I told him that we had run it through the mass spectrometer. I told him that Gideon was selling unrectified citrus oil in a luxury perfume. I told him that people were going to get hurt. Silas's face hardened. He was a grumpy man and a recluse, but he was a professional. The idea of hurting a customer was anathema to him. He slammed the bottle down on the table. He called Gideon a reckless fool. He said that cutting costs was one thing, but negligence was another. I leaned forward and asked him about the invoices. I told him that I knew Gideon was cooking the books, but I couldn't prove it because he had scrubbed the servers and locked the physical files. I asked Silas if he had kept anything, any records, any proof of the switch. Silas looked at the fire for a long time. The only sound in the room was the crackle of the logs and the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Finally, he turned to me, and a grim smile played on his lips. He said that Gideon was arrogant. He said that Gideon thought that because he had revoked Silas's email access, he had erased Silas's memory. But Silas said that he had been the floor manager for 20 years, and he kept his own logs. He said he didn't trust computers. He trusted paper. He walked over to a loose floorboard in the corner of the room under a moth-eaten rug. He pried it up with a fireplace poker and pulled out a metal lockbox. He brought it over to the table and unlocked it with a key he wore around his neck. Inside was a stack of papers, thick and yellowed at the edges. He handed me the stack. I began to leaf through them, and my heart rate accelerated. These were the raw material intake forms for the last 6 months. They were the originals signed by the delivery drivers. I saw the orders for the cheap chemicals: phthalates, industrial ethanol, synthetic jasmine. But then I saw something else. I saw the billing invoices attached to the intake forms. The supplier listed was a company called Verdant Holdings Limited. I showed the paper to Renard. He frowned and pulled out his phone. Despite the remote location, he managed to get a weak signal. He ran a search on the company registry. Renard let out a low whistle. He told us that Verdant Holdings was a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. He dug deeper, scrolling through the corporate filings. He found the name of the director. It wasn't Gideon. It was a lawyer in Zurich, but the beneficiary address was a postbox in the village right next to the Finch estate. We put the pieces together right there in the cabin. Gideon was buying the cheap chemicals for pennies on the dollar through this shell company. Then the shell company was selling the chemicals to Maison Finch at the price of premium natural ingredients. Gideon was authorizing the payments from Maison Finch to Verdant Holdings. He wasn't just saving money for the company, he was siphoning millions of dollars out of the company accounts and into his own private offshore fund. He was embezzling on a massive scale. Silas pointed to a specific invoice dated 3 weeks ago. It was for the Cœur Pur batch. The invoice from Verdant Holdings charged Maison Finch $2 million for premium grass jasmine absolute. The attached shipping manifest from the actual chemical plant in New Jersey showed a shipment of generic floral compound 4B with a value of $5,000. This was it. This was the smoking gun. It was fraud. It was embezzlement. It was grand larceny. And we had the paper trail that linked it all directly to Gideon's signature on the purchase orders. I looked at Silas, and I felt a surge of gratitude that almost brought me to tears. I told him that this was everything. I told him that with this, we could not only stop the sale, but we could send Gideon to prison for a very long time. Silas closed the box and pushed it toward me. He told me to take it. He said he didn't want it in his house. He said it smelled like corruption. But then he looked at me and asked what the plan was. He asked if I was going to the police. I looked at Renard and then back at the papers. The police would take weeks. They would need warrants and investigations, and by the time they moved, Gideon would have sold the company and fled the country. The gala was in 2 days. The Omnicorp executives would be there. The press would be there. I told Silas that the police were the second step. The first step was the gala. I told him that I was going to destroy Gideon in front of the very people he was trying to impress. I was going to serve him up on a platter. Silas puffed on his pipe and a twinkle appeared in his eye. He asked if he could come. He said he wouldn't miss seeing the look on Gideon's face for all the tea in China. We left the cabin with the lockbox in the back seat of the Jaguar. The drive down the mountain felt faster. The sun was high in the sky now, and the world looked bright and sharp. I had the science from the lab, I had the financial proof from the cabin, and I had a team. Renard the strategist, Silas the witness, and me the nose. As we drove back toward the valley, I began to formulate the details of the plan. We needed to get into the gala without being seen. Gideon would have security looking for me. He would have told them I was a confused old woman who had wandered off. If I walked in the front door, they would drag me out before I could open my mouth. We needed a Trojan horse. I looked at Renard's car, and then I looked at the vineyards rushing past. The gala was a black tie event, but it was also a celebration of the harvest. Deliveries would be coming in all day. Catering trucks, floral arrangements, wine shipments. I turned to Renard and asked him if he still had his old delivery van, the one with the Dubois Flowers logo on the side. Renard smiled and shifted gears. He said that he did. He asked me what I had in mind. I told him that Gideon was expecting investors and celebrities. He wasn't expecting the help. And nobody looks at the florists carrying the centerpieces. We were going to walk right in through the service entrance under his very nose. We arrived back at Renard's estate as the sun was setting. The sky was a bruised purple and the air was cooling. I took the lockbox into the library and we spent the evening organizing the documents. We made copies. We highlighted the discrepancies. We built a case that was watertight. But as I looked at the pile of evidence, I realized one thing was missing. I had the facts, but I needed the emotion. I needed to make the investors feel the betrayal. I needed to bypass their brains and hit them in their limbic system. I went to my bag and took out the master sample of the real Cœur Pur. I held the vial up to the light. This was my weapon. Words can be debated. Documents can be questioned. But a smell is visceral. It is immediate. If I could make them smell the difference between the truth and the lie, I wouldn't just win the argument, I would win their souls. I went to sleep that night with the scent of justice in my mind. It smelled of ozone and old paper and the sharp, clean bite of winter air. Gideon Finch had spent his life underestimating me. He thought I was just a nose attached to a checkbook. He was about to find out that I was the one who could smell his fear. The drive to the Finch estate usually filled me with a sense of pride. seeing the limestone walls rising out of the valley mist. But tonight, crouching in the back of a delivery van that smelled of damp cardboard and cut stems, I felt like a partisan fighter infiltrating an occupied city. Renard was driving, muttering curses at the gearbox of his vintage Citroën van, while Silas sat in the passenger seat, looking uncomfortable in a tuxedo that was 20 years out of date. We were the Trojan horse of the floral world. The van was filled with massive arrangements of white lilies and ferns, ostensibly a late addition to the gala's decor, courtesy of Dubois Flowers. In reality, the lilies were shielding 3 people who were about to detonate a bomb in the center of high society. Through the small window between the cab and the cargo hold, I saw the lights of the estate. Gideon had spared no expense. Searchlights swept the sky, and the driveway was lined with valet parking attendants rushing to open the doors of limousines. The air outside would be thick with the exhaust of luxury cars and the expensive perfumes of the guests, but inside the van, I was focused on my own preparation. Renard had proven to be a man of surprising resources. That morning, before we left his estate, he had led me to a cedar closet in his guest wing. Inside were the clothes of his late wife, Marie, a woman of impeccable taste who had passed away a decade ago. He had pulled out a gown of black velvet with a high collar and long sleeves, a 1950s Balenciaga that was severe, elegant, and commanding. It fit me as if it had been tailored for my own frame. I adjusted the collar and checked my reflection in the side mirror of the van. I did not look like the confused old woman Gideon had described to the doctors. I looked like a matriarch in mourning, a dark angel coming to collect a debt. But the most important part of my armor was not the velvet, it was the scent. I took the wax-sealed vial of the master sample from my pocket. I dabbed a single drop behind each ear and one on the pulse point of my throat. The aroma bloomed instantly in the confined space. It was rich, animalic, and deeply floral. The true scent of Cœur Pur. It smelled of history. It smelled of truth. It was a sharp contrast to the Dubois Flowers lilies, which, though beautiful, had no scent because modern florists breathe the smell out of them to extend their shelf life. Gideon was doing the same to my company, trading the soul for longevity. The van slowed to a crawl. We were at the service gate. I held my breath. If the security team had my photo, this could end before it began. "Delivery for the main hall," Renard growled at the guard. "Late request from Mr. Finch. Something about the stage looking too bare." I heard the guard grunt. "I don't have a Dubois on the list." "That's because Mr. Finch called me an hour ago screaming about hydrangeas." Renard improvised with the confidence of a man who had done his share of screaming about flowers. "You want to call him and tell him his stage is empty? Be my guest. I'm happy to turn around and bill him anyway." There was a pause. The guard was weighing the risk of annoying his boss against the risk of letting in a florist. Class bias won out. He didn't see a threat. He just saw a grumpy tradesman. "Go ahead," the guard sighed. "Service entrance round the back. Make it quick." The van lurched forward. I let out a breath. We were inside. Renard parked near the kitchen loading dock. The area was a chaotic hive of catering staff carrying trays of canapés and crates of champagne. We stepped out of the van, Silas carrying a large crate of supplies which actually contained the lockbox of invoices. I carried nothing but my dignity. We walked past the busy kitchen staff. No one looked at us. In their eyes, Renard and Silas were just vendors, and I, in my black velvet, was perhaps a lost guest or a supervisor. We moved through the back corridors, the arteries of the house that I knew better than anyone. We navigated the pantry, the servants' hall, and the narrow passage that led behind the stage of the great ballroom. I could hear the hum of the crowd through the heavy curtains. It sounded like a swarm of bees. Hundreds of people were out there. Investors, press, local dignitaries, and the vultures from Omnicorp. "Wait here," I whispered to Renard and Silas. "I need to gauge the moment." I found a small spy hole in the velvet curtain, a tear I had meant to have mended years ago. I peered through. The ballroom was transformed. Gideon had draped everything in silver and white. It looked cold. It looked like a mausoleum. Gideon was standing at the podium, bathed in a spotlight. He looked triumphant. He was holding a microphone in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other. Seated at a table directly in front of the stage were Mr. Kalin and Ms. Mercer from Omnicorp, along with a team of lawyers who had a stack of documents ready for signing.
Ladies and gentlemen, Gideon's voice boomed over the speakers, smooth and synthetic. Tonight we celebrate a century of excellence. My father, Arthur Finch, built this house on a foundation of tradition. But tradition cannot stand still. It must evolve. He paused for effect. The audience applauded politely. I saw Mr. Kalin nod approvingly. Tonight, Gideon continued, marks the beginning of a new era. An era of expansion. An era of global reach. With our partnership with Omnicorp, Maison Finch will no longer just be a French treasure. It will be a household name in every city from Shanghai to New York. He was selling it well. He was selling the empty shell of the company while pocketing the marrow. "I know," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, "that my stepmother, Isadora, wished she could be here tonight. Sadly, her health has taken a turn, and she is resting comfortably in a facility where she can receive the care she needs. But I know she would want us to look forward, not back." The rage I felt was cold and sharp. He had buried me alive. He had turned me into a tragic footnote in his success story. "So," Gideon said, turning to the table of lawyers, "let us sign the future into existence." Mr. Kalin stood up, adjusting his jacket. He picked up a gold fountain pen. A photographer moved into position to capture the historic moment. I turned to Renard and Silas. "Now." Silas nodded and adjusted his grip on the lockbox. Renard straightened his tie. I pushed the heavy velvet curtain aside. I did not sneak. I did not stumble. I walked onto the stage with the stride of a woman who owns the floorboards beneath her feet. The movement caught the eye of the front row first. Heads turned. Then the murmur started. It rippled backward through the room like a wave. Gideon was focused on the contract. He didn't see me until the silence in the room became absolute. The applause had died. The music had stopped. The only sound was the click of my heels on the hardwood stage. Gideon looked up. His face went slack. For a moment, he looked like a child caught stealing from the cookie jar. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving them ashy and gray. "Mother?" he whispered, but the microphone picked it up, amplifying his fear for the whole room to hear. I stopped center stage, 10 feet away from him. I didn't need a microphone. I had projected my voice to the back of lecture halls for years. "You seem surprised, Gideon," I said, my voice clear and cutting. "Did the facility lose my paperwork? Or did you just forget to check the locks?" Mr. Kalin froze, the pen hovering inches from the paper. He looked from Gideon to me, confusion clouding his face. "Isadora," Gideon stammered, trying to recover his composure. He stepped toward me, holding out a hand as if to guide a lost animal. "Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, my stepmother she is confused. She shouldn't be here. Security." 2 large men in dark suits started to move toward the stage from the wings. "Stay back," I commanded, pointing a finger at them. It wasn't a plea. It was an order. They hesitated. I turned back to the audience.
I am not confused, Gideon. In fact, I have never been more lucid, and I am not here to ruin your party. I am here to save your guests from a very bad investment. She's having an episode, Gideon shouted, his voice rising in panic. Please, cut the mic! Get her off the stage! But the sound engineer, a local boy who had worked for us for years, didn't cut the mic. He watched, fascinated. I stepped closer to Gideon, and that was when it hit him. The smell. The air conditioning on the stage blew the scent of the real cœur pur directly toward him and the investors in the front row. I saw Miss Mercer's nose twitch. She frowned. She leaned forward, sniffing the air. "What is that?" she murmured to Mr. Kalin. "That," I said, addressing her directly, "is the smell of a $2 million mistake." I gestured to Silas. He walked onto the stage and slammed the metal lockbox onto the table in front of the investors. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "These," I said, "are the invoices from a shell company called Verdant Holdings. They show that while my stepson was charging the company for premium Jasmine Absolute, he was actually buying industrial synthetic filler." Gideon lunged for the box. "That's a lie! Those are forgeries!" Renard stepped out from the curtain then, blocking Gideon's path. Renard was 70, but he was broad and he looked ready to brawl. "They are not forgeries, boy. And neither is the mass spectrometer reading I have in my pocket proving your current batch contains unrectified bergamot." The room gasped. The word unrectified meant nothing to the public, but to the industry insiders in the room, it was a horror story. "Bergamot?" Miss Mercer stood up, her face pale. "That's phototoxic. You're putting that in a skin product?" "It's a lie!" Gideon screamed, sweat beading on his forehead. "She's senile! She's trying to sabotage me!" I looked at Mr. Kalin. He was a businessman. He dealt in facts, but I needed to give him something more than facts. "Mr. Kalin," I said softly, "you are about to buy a legacy, but you need to know what you are buying." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small blue bottle, the fake one Renard had bought. I held it up in my left hand. In my right hand, I held the master sample. "This," I said, shaking the blue bottle, "is what Gideon is selling you. It smells of greed and shortcuts. It has no soul." I uncorked the master sample. I didn't need to spray it. The heat of the stage lights warmed the oil, and the scent rolled off the stage like a fog. It was heavy, golden, and undeniable. It smelled of the earth and the sky and 40 years of love. "And this," I said, "is Maison Finch. This is what you think you are buying. But Gideon doesn't know how to make this. He only knows how to steal the money meant to create it." The scent reached the front row. Mr. Kalin inhaled. He closed his eyes. It was a visceral reaction. The quality was so superior, so obviously different from the product in the stores, that no argument could stand against it. Mr. Kalin opened his eyes. He looked at Gideon. He looked at the sweat running down Gideon's face. He looked at the desperation in his eyes. Then he looked at the contract on the table. He put the gold pen back in his pocket. "I think," Mr. Kalin said, his voice cutting through the silence, "that we need to take a recess. My team needs to review those invoices." "No!" Gideon shouted. "You can't listen to her. The deal is done." "The deal," Mr. Kalin said coldly, "is contingent on due diligence, and it seems we missed a few things." Gideon looked around the room. The guests were whispering. Cameras were flashing. His triumph was dissolving in real time. He turned to me, his eyes filled with a pure, distilled hatred. "You ruined it," he hissed. "You old witch, you burned it all down."
No, Gideon, I said, smoothing the velvet of my dress. I didn't burn it down. I just turned on the light. I looked at Renard and Silas. They stood like sentinels on either side of me. The security guards had backed off. The police, whom Renard had called en route, would be arriving shortly. The gala was over. The party was ruined. But as I stood there in the center of the stage, smelling the notes of jasmine and ambergris swirling around me, I knew that the legacy was safe. The air was finally clear. The silence in the ballroom was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a held breath before the plunge. Gideon stood on the stage with his face glistening under the harsh theatrical lights and his chest heaving with the exertion of his denial. He looked at the lockbox of invoices, and then at the investors, and then at me, and I saw the desperate calculus occurring behind his eyes. He realized that denial was no longer enough because the evidence was physical and heavy on the table. He needed to discredit the source. He laughed then, and it was a jagged and brittle sound that bounced off the high ceilings. He pointed a shaking finger at me and told the crowd that this was a pathetic display. He said that the liquid in the blue bottle was tampered with. He claimed that I had injected it with contaminants to sabotage the launch. He turned to Ms. Mercer and Mr. Kalin with a pleading look and told them that the production line was flawless and that his stepmother was a vindictive woman who would burn her own house down to rule over the ashes. I watched him spin his web, and I felt a strange sense of detachment. He was fighting for his life, but he was fighting with the wrong weapons. He was using words in a room full of sensory experts. Ms. Mercer was not just a corporate suit, she was a trained evaluator with a nose insured for $1 million. I knew her reputation. She could detect a single drop of rose oxide in a gallon of ethanol. I stepped forward, and the crowd parted slightly. I told Gideon that if he was so confident in the purity of his product, then he should have no objection to a blind test. I told him that words could lie and invoices could be debated, but the nose never lies. I turned to Miss Mercer and offered her the testing strips. I asked her to be the judge. I asked her to tell the room if the liquid in the blue bottle was a luxury perfume or a chemical hazard. Gideon tried to intervene. He moved to block Miss Mercer, but Renard stepped in his path. Renard did not touch him, he simply stood there like a boulder in a stream, and Gideon bounced off him. Miss Mercer stood up. She was a tall woman with steel-gray eyes, and she looked at Gideon with a cold, professional curiosity. She took the blue bottle from the table. She did not spray it into the air, she sprayed it onto the testing strip with a precise and practiced motion. She brought the strip to her nose. She waved it gently to let the alcohol evaporate. The room waited. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the distant clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Ms. Mercer inhaled once. She paused. She inhaled again, deeper this time. Her expression shifted from neutrality to distaste. She looked at Gideon and spoke in a voice that carried to the back of the room without a microphone. She said that the top note was aggressive and metallic. She said she detected high levels of gallic solide, which is a cheap musk used in laundry detergent. Then she frowned and brought the strip closer. She said there was a distinct acidic bite that suggested unrefined citrus oils. She looked at me and nodded. She confirmed that it smelled of unrectified bergamot. The crowd murmured. The spell was broken. Gideon's face turned the color of old parchment. But he was not done. He was a cornered animal, and he lashed out. He shouted that she was biased. He shouted that I had paid her off. He grabbed the blue bottle from her hand and held it up like a holy relic. He screamed that it was safe. He screamed that it was pure. I looked at him, and I saw the opening for the final blow. I told him that if it was pure, he should prove it. I challenged him to apply it to his skin. I told the room that unrectified bergamot is phototoxic. I explained that under these hot stage lights, if that liquid touched his skin, it would cause second-degree burns within minutes.
I dared him to spray it on his neck. Gideon froze. He looked at the bottle in his hand. He looked at the burning white spotlights above him. He knew the chemistry. He knew exactly what was in that bottle because he had signed the orders for the cheap oil. If he sprayed it, he would scar himself for life. If he didn't spray it, he admitted his guilt. His hand trembled. He lowered the bottle. He couldn't do it. The rejection was absolute. Mr. Kalin stood up and signaled to his legal team. They began to pack their briefcases with a frantic efficiency. Mr. Kalin looked at Gideon with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He told Gideon that the deal was terminated effective immediately. He said that Omnicorp would be launching an internal investigation into the due diligence failure, and that Gideon would be hearing from their legal department regarding the breach of contract. Gideon stood alone on the stage, holding the bottle of poison he had tried to sell as gold. He looked at me and his eyes were hollow. He asked me why I couldn't just let it go. He asked me why I had to ruin him. I walked up to him until I was close enough to smell the sour reek of his fear. It smelled of adrenaline and stale champagne and the disintegration of a man who had never built anything real in his life. I told him that I didn't ruin him. I told him that he ruined himself the moment he thought that quality was negotiable. I told him that the legacy of Arthur Finch was not a bank account, it was a promise, and he had broken it. Then the doors at the back of the ballroom burst open. The heavy oak doors slammed against the walls, and the sound echoed like a thunderclap. 4 police officers marched in, flanked by a detective in a trench coat. Renard had timed the call perfectly. The detective walked down the center aisle. The guests parted like the Red Sea. He climbed the stairs to the stage and approached Gideon. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask for a statement. He simply took the lockbox from Silas and handed it to an officer. Then he turned to Gideon and recited his rights. I watched as they placed the handcuffs on my stepson. The metal clicked shut, and it was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a cage closing, but this time I was on the outside. Gideon looked at me one last time as they led him away. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked small. He looked like a child who had gotten lost in the woods. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Silas. He was smiling through his beard. He told me that was a hell of a show. Renard was on my other side, lighting a cigarette despite the strict no-smoking policy of the ballroom. He blew a ring of smoke toward the ceiling and said that the boy finally got the attention he craved. The investors had fled. The party was dissolving into chaos. But I stood on the stage and took a deep breath. The air was still thick with the scent of the master sample I had released. It overpowered the cheap musk. It overpowered the fear. It smelled of jasmine and amber and victory. I looked out at the empty tables and the ruined gala, and I knew that the hard work was just beginning. The company was in shambles. The reputation was damaged. But the rot was gone. The parasite had been removed. I turned to Renard and Silas. I told them that we had a factory to clean. I told them that tomorrow we were going to dump every vat of that synthetic swill into the hazardous waste disposal. I told them that we were going to start over. Renard offered me his arm. He asked me if I wanted a ride home. I looked at him and realized that for the first time in a week, I wasn't afraid to go home. The house was mine again. The lab was mine again. And the nose that had saved me was twitching with the scent of a new beginning. The drain in the center of the factory floor was an industrial grate that led to a chemical disposal tank. But today, it looked like the mouth of a hungry beast. I stood on the catwalk, watching the thick blue liquid pouring out of vat number 4. It moved sluggishly like toxic sludge. The air was filled with the cloying chemical sweetness of Gideon's fake perfume as thousands of gallons of it were flushed away forever. It was $3 million of product going down the drain, but to me, it looked like a cleansing. Silas stood next to the release valve, his hands gloved and his face set in a grim line of satisfaction. He turned the wheel until the last drops trickled out. He looked up at me and gave a thumbs up. The nightmare was over. The factory was empty, but it was clean. It had been 3 weeks since the gala. The fallout had been swift and brutal. The police investigation had uncovered not just the embezzlement from the chemical supplies, but a web of offshore accounts and gambling debts that made my head spin. Gideon was currently being held without bail, considered a flight risk. The lawyers told me he was looking at 10 to 15 years for fraud and elder abuse. I didn't visit him. I didn't send him a letter. I simply washed my hands of him just as we were washing the tanks. I walked down the stairs to the main floor where the workers were scrubbing the stainless steel with odorless solvent. They were my workers again. I had rehired everyone Gideon had fired. The factory hummed with a different kind of energy now. It wasn't the frantic pace of profit at any cost. It was the steady rhythm of craftsmen doing a job they loved. Renard was waiting for me in the glass-walled office. He was sitting at Gideon's desk, or rather my desk now, with his feet up on the mahogany surface reading the Financial Times. He looked up as I entered. He told me that the stock price had stabilized. He said that the market likes a redemption story. The press had painted me as the iron matriarch who saved her family legacy from corruption. It was a good narrative. It sold bottles. I sat down in the leather chair opposite him. I looked at this man who had been my enemy for 30 years and who was now my most trusted advisor. I asked him if he was ever going to go back to his own company. Renard shrugged and lit a cigarette, ignoring the glare of the new safety officer. He said that his company ran itself these days. He said he was having too much fun watching me rebuild mine. We were a strange team. Isadora the nose, Renard the shark, and Silas the backbone. We were 3 people who society said should be retired. We should be playing bridge and waiting for the end. Instead, we were running a global luxury brand. We were proof that experience is not a depreciating asset. It is compound interest. Later that afternoon, I walked back to the house. The locks had all been changed back. The security team had been replaced. Mrs. Gable met me at the door with a pot of tea, and this time, I drank it without fear because I had watched her brew it myself. The house felt lighter. The shadows that Gideon had cast were gone. I went out to the orangery. The glass was clean and the sun streamed in, warming the shelves of essential oils. I unlocked the safe, the old one with the tumblers, and placed the black book back inside. The records were safe. The history was secure, but I wasn't done yet. I stood before my perfume organ and looked at the empty vials. I had a new scent in my head. It had come to me during the chaos of the gala. I wanted to capture the smell of that night. Not the fear and not the cheap musk. I wanted to capture the moment of truth. I began to blend. I started with a base of oak moss and vetiver for the grounding strength of the earth. I added a heart note of wild tobacco for Silas and a sharp accord of leather for Renard. And then, for the top note, I did something unusual. I used a distillation of ozone. It is the smell of the air after a storm. It is the smell of clarity. I worked for hours, losing myself in the chemistry. When I finally lifted the testing strip to my nose, it was perfect. It was cold and sharp and undeniably strong. It didn't smell like a flower. It smelled like justice. I decided I would call it l'orage, the storm. It would be the first fragrance released under the new management. It would be a warning and a promise. A warning to anyone who thought they could trick us, and a promise that the Finch legacy would never be diluted again. I walked out of the orangery and stood on the lawn as the sun began to set over the lavender fields. The purple flowers were swaying in the breeze, releasing their scent into the cooling air. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the smell of my home. I thought about Gideon sitting in his cell. I wondered if he finally understood. He had tried to steal the scent of success, but he never learned that you cannot synthesize a soul. He looked at the price of everything and the value of nothing. I am Isadora Finch. I am 68 years old. I have wrinkles and I have gray hair, and my hands shake sometimes when I am tired. But my nose is sharp, my mind is clear, and I am still standing. The world tries to tell women of a certain age that we are invisible. It tries to tell us that we should step aside and let the young men take over. Gideon tried to tell me that. He tried to gaslight me into silence. But he forgot that fire needs oxygen to burn, and I was the one who controlled the air. I looked at the house glowing in the twilight. It was battered, and the reputation was bruised, but the foundation was solid stone. We would rebuild, we would replant, and we would make the world smell beautiful again, one drop at a time. So that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. Do you think I should have forgiven Gideon because he was family? Or do you think he got exactly what he deserved for trying to destroy my mind and my legacy? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.